Welcome once again to our science lesson. In our previous lesson, we have been trying to find out how communication and body coordination happens in our bodies. And we mentioned two systems that achieve communication in our bodies. We have the nervous system and endocrine system. So we have gone through all the systems. We have found out their major features. So our lesson for now is just to summarize the two by trying to compare the two systems, nervous and endocrine system. So we shall use a table for the same. So in our table, we shall have a feature or characteristic, and then we shall have the nervous system here, and endocrine system. So some of the characteristics that we shall focus on, for instance, shall be cells of the system. Cells of the system. In other words, what kind of structures are involved in the nervous system, the major one, and structures in the endocrine system. So for the cells in the nervous system, we identified the neurons as the basic and structural functional unit of the nervous system. Therefore, in this space, we put here neurons. So neurons here forms the cells that are actually majorly involved in the nervous system. For endocrine system, we said we have two major factors, but the most important ones are the glands. So we have glands, or cells of the glands. Number two, we look at the pathway. We look at the pathway. So where does, for instance, in the nervous system, we expect impulses to be transmitted from effectors, from receptors to the central nervous system, then from central nervous system to effectors. So where are these impulses going to flow? So that's the pathway. Still they'll flow through neurons. Impulses flow through neurons. That is how we describe the reflex arc, where or how the impulses will be moving from the receptors to the central nervous system to the effectors through sensory neuron, relay neuron, and then motor neuron. And then endocrine system, we have just looked at it as the previous lesson. We say that glands are going to be stimulated to release hormones. But those hormones do not have very clear path or very clear route through which the hormones are going to flow. So instead, glands will release hormones which will diffuse into the blood system, and then the blood system takes over the role of transporting hormones from the glands to the effector organs. So the pathway becomes blood, circulatory system. Circulatory system is the pathway. Another feature we look at is the speed of signal. Speed of the signal. For the nervous system, we can use an example. If you step on a sharp object, you don't have to think if you have to remove your foot or your hand on a hot object, that one happens very quickly. That's why we described a reflex as a quick automatic response to an external stimulus. So in the nervous system, the speed of signal is usually very fast. But for the endocrine system, look at how, for instance, look at hormones like adrenaline hormone. First of all, if it has to be released, you'll have to cite a very dangerous situation. For instance, you have seen a lion, you have seen the lion, the brain will interpret that that's a lion, and then if you think much about it, a lion can be harmful if it's not caged. That's thought process. It is going to take a longer time. Then now an impulse will be sent to pituitary gland. Pituitary gland releases a hormone, adrenocortical tropic hormone, to adrenal gland. Adrenal gland releases adrenaline hormone. You look at that procedure, it is very long. So because of that, you realize that the speed of transmission of the messages in the endocrine system is usually slow. So in this space, we are going to say the nervous impulses are rapid. Nervous impulse are rapid. In other words, very quick. But for endocrine system, the response is slow. We can give very many examples just to justify this. For instance, if a boy has to develop into manhood, we have hormones that are involved at puberty. Testosterone has to be released. That one is going to take a longer time. That is something that usually takes even years or some few months. We can also look at another aspect, the speed, and then duration of action, the effect, duration of action. If a nerve impulse has been released or is being transmitted through the nervous system or through the neurons, as we have already identified, what will be the duration of the effect? The effect does not last long. For instance, the example that I've used, touching on a hot object, you do it very fast. So the duration here lasts for a short while. But for endocrine system, the effect of hormones can last for a longer time. Look at the effect of growth hormones. Growth hormones usually have, in fact, slightly permanent effect on an individual. Once somebody has grown, he cannot regress back to the original position. So duration of action, effect is short-lived. Effect is short-lived. But for endocrine system, the duration of action, the effect lasts long, or lasts longer as compared to that. You can also look at another feature number 5, target cells. Target cell, or the effectors. Nervous system, the effectors are usually specific. For instance, if the effectors are muscles of the hand, it is just that hand that's going to pull out of that hot object. The specific target cell or receptor was the bicep of that hand, the one that was touching on a hot object. So here the target cell is usually single and specific. But for endocrine system, because hormones are released by the glands and then they diffuse into blood, you realize that the hormones will have a general, will have slightly localized. It's going to be it will affect very many other structures or very many other organs. So for target cell here, effectors are single and specific parts of the body. But here it could be general. Most cells are exposed. Most cells are exposed. Why? Because there's diffusion of the hormones into the blood, and the blood is spreading all over the body. That's why adrenaline, like a hormone, is going to have effect all over the body. You realize that the heartbeat will increase, conversion of glycogen from skeletal tissues to glucose, so that now it is going to spread all over the body so that it reaches the skeletal muscles, constriction of blood vessels in the gut region, so that now blood is more focused or concentrated in the skeletal muscles. So it's affecting all over. And then we can look at the example. We have given several examples of the nervous system, specifically the reflex action. We can use the knee-jerk reaction. Knee-jerk reaction. We went through this example, say that when you tap, you can just review it. If that is your leg, and then you suspend it over another, if you tap the tendon at that point, just below the kneecap, what happens? The leg will jerk forward. That's why it is called the knee jerk reaction. So if you tap that point, that tendon below the knee jerk, the kneecap, that is, the foot or the leg jerks forward. So that is an example of the nervous system or a reflex arc. So we can slightly write a note there, knee jerk reaction, when you tap below the, or when you tap the tendon, not below. When you tap the tendon below the kneecap, leg jerks forward. An example for endocrine we can use when you see, or when you are anxious, when you see a lion, adrenaline is secreted, which then causes increased heartbeat. So, as you have gone through, you can easily now try to remember the things that, or the concepts that we have had in endocrine system and those one of the nervous system. So you can easily now distinguish, if you are told to differentiate between the nervous system and endocrine system, through this comparison, you can follow through and give very clear differences. So I want to look at another aspect apart from animals, plant responses. So for plant to respond to changes in the environment or to stimuli, it will be through production of hormones. Remember, plants, just like any other living thing, they are able to respond to changes in the environment. So plants, just like all living organisms, respond to stimuli. Remember, we have said stimuli is that change in the environment. But before we go further to plant responses, we must realize that plants are slightly different from animals, in that plants, most of them are stationary. And because they are stationary, they are less active. Plants are less active. Most plants are less active. And if you look at their structure, they're also less complex and less complex. So why are they less complex? You look at their systems. They'll have fewer systems than you have. Your body has several: reproductive system, excretory system, nervous system, endocrine system. But for plants, they'll have less of the systems. So because of them being less active and less complex, the rate at which, or the sensitivity, the rate at which they are going to respond to changes in the environment is also very slow. Therefore, they respond to changes, to stimuli at slow rate. And there's a reason why they do that. Because most of the responses is driven by hormones. Response in plants is driven by hormones. If you just go back to endocrine system, we have said that where hormones are involved, that kind of response is going to be slow, like in the endocrine system, because hormones have to diffuse first in blood. Blood has to circulate to carry the hormones to target organs, and then target organ change the activity or respond. So because of that, you realize that response in plants is very slow. But how do they respond? Are they going to move from the position they are to a different position? That one does not happen. Response in plants is usually in form of growth movements of the parts. So the parts are the one that will move. Either the roots will be moving, the branches will be moving, or parts of the leaves will be moving in response to change in the environment or to stimuli. So the responses are in form of growth movements. Responses in plants are in form of growth movements. Growth movements. And those growth movements, they're just parts, not the whole plant. They're just parts. Andika nje hapo. These growth movements involve parts of the plants. So these growth movements that's involving part of the plants to bring about response is what we call tropism. Tropism. So in our lesson today, I want us to emphasize on this term, tropism. So we shall define it again, tropisms. So what are these tropisms? Are growth movements, in parts of the plants in response to changes in the external environment. Now we can give a very simple example here. If you grow a bean plant close to a window, you can do it even at home. Some few seeds, you put it in a pot with soil and water, some good amount, that is correct amount of water, and then you put it next to your window. Then you leave it for a week. You realize that the bean plant will germinate, and as it grows, it will be growing towards the outside or toward the light. So it is just the parts of the bean that's growing, but in response to an external stimuli, or to an external stimuli in this case, which is light. So we are going to look at several examples of the tropisms. But before that, we can just give that example. E.g., when a bean seedling is left to grow next to a window, it grows towards light. So it is the part, remember parts, the shoot that is just growing, not the whole plant moving. It could have moved if it had that ability, but it's just the parts that are continually extending outside the window or through the window so that it can enable the plant reach light. And light here is very important because it is a very important component of photosynthesis. So it's just trying to do that to respond to the change in the external environment to reach light for photosynthesis. We shall look at several examples of these tropisms. But before we look at these tropisms, we have said that they are influenced by hormones. Tropisms are influenced by hormones. But now, not all hormones are going to influence tropism. We cannot have adrenaline being injected into a plant and then influencing tropism, or any other like progesterone, testosterone, those that we have looked at, thyroxine. It cannot have an effect in plants. So we have specific hormones in plants that are involved in growth movements. Some of those hormones include, very important, two of them, auxins, and we have gibberellins. So briefly we look at the two auxins with a view of establishing their source. Do plants have their own auxins? Can they produce their own auxin? Or do we have another source? And what's the effect? Another name for auxin is indole acetic acid. So some other literatures will cite this one as IAA. IAA meaning indole acetic acid. So auxins, where the source? Auxins are mainly produced by plants, but the specific parts of the plant are the shoot tip and the root tip. shoot and the root tip. So these parts are usually very characteristic in nature, such that they have actively dividing cells with very undeveloped cells, and because of that, they are given this term meristematic cells or meristematic structures. So if you want to extract auxins from a plant, all you have to do is take a plant, identify the shoot and the root tip. You can cut and then extract the hormones from the lab. Effect of auxins include effects of auxins is mainly causing cell elongation. They cause cell elongation. They cause cell elongation. Now, on this effect, you have noticed that, for example, if a plant is cut at the shoot tip, it stops growing because the source of auxin has been removed, and because of that, it is going to impair cell elongation. Cell elongation brings about growth. That's why you realize that if you have ever gone to a place where tea is grown, if they pick, most of the time they are picking at the tip, that part. So you realize that because of that, we only have a lateral growth from the sideways. But the primary growth or the main growth upwards is impaired because the source of auxin, which is the shoot tip, has been removed. But the effect of auxin on shoot and root is usually different. Auxins have stimulatory effect on the shoot. In other words, high concentration of auxins in shoot will increase the rate of cell elongation. But for the root, it is the opposite. It is antagonistic. It has inhibitory effect. Auxins have inhibitory effect on roots. So this is very important for us because as we shall be explaining how auxins bring about tropism, this concept must be in our mind that auxins will stimulate growth in shoots, auxins will inhibit growth in roots. So for instance, if you have this, if for example you have a bean seedling, a bean, you can just have a sketch of the same. That's a bean seedling, it has grown, the radical is there in that position. And then we have the shoot is coming out, that position. Shoot, and then we have the root. And then you keep this seedling in this position. Maybe you use a pin, you attach on a board like that. This is a pin. We shall have high concentration of auxin accumulating on the lower part of this shoot and the root. So we have here high concentration, high concentration. This accumulation is due to effect of gravity. Gravity is pulling auxins at the shoot tip to that position, to that position. We have already said that auxins have stimulatory effect on shoots. So where we have high concentration of auxins at that point, we shall have high rate of cell elongation. So at that point, it will elongate at the expense of that point. So if that was the original, what will happen is that that shoot will start bending upwards. Because what has happened, there was a lot of growth, cell elongation at that point, than at the upper point. it has stimulated growth where it is, but in shoots. In roots, it has inhibitory effect. It is going to inhibit growth there. So here, at the upper part, we shall have high rate of cell elongation. The lower part, we shall have low rate of cell elongation. If we are going to have high rate at that point and low rate at the lower point, the root bends downwards. So that is how auxins can be able to bring about growth curvatures or growth parts of the plant responding to the various stimuli that we are going to look at. Another hormone, number 2, is the gibberellin, just to find out what the effects of gibberellins include. One of them is the one that brings about enlargement of leaves, leaf enlargement, and is also involved in cell elongation, brings about cell elongation. So it is also going to play a very important part in tropism. Some parts will be elongating at a higher rate than the other. Also brings about flowering. Flowering in flowering plants. Flowering plants are called angiosperms. Brings about flowering in angiosperms. And then again brings about fruit development. Fruit development. But the reason why we are including gibberellins in this category or in this concept is due to having an effect on the cell, bring about cell elongation. Any effect or any factor that will bring about cell elongation then will also help in tropism. Types of tropisms. Now, there are several types of tropism depending on the stimuli that evokes the response. There are several types. Several types of tropism depending on the stimuli that evokes the response. In other words, it will depend on the stimuli that brings about, evokes. You can substitute it with the word brings about the response. So we are going to look at several stimuli, examples of stimuli that can bring about responses, examples of stimuli that can bring about responses in plants include: 1, light, as we have just used an example previously. Light. If tropism will be evoked by light, it shall be called phototropism. Phototropism. Another stimuli could be gravity. If the plants are going to respond to gravity, then that tropism shall be called geotropism. If the stimuli is maybe chemicals, like for example the pollen tube, when pollen grains lands on the stigma, it usually germinates and then forms a tube that will deliver the generative and male nuclei to the embryo sac. For that one to happen, for the pollen tube to grow down the style of the flower, it is going to respond to some chemicals produced in the embryo sac. So if there are chemicals that is the stimuli, then shall be called chemotropism. chemotropism. Water. Plants respond to water. That's why the roots will be growing into the soil, because it is the soil where we have moisture. They'll absorb moisture to be used by the plant. So if the response, the stimuli, is water, that tropism shall be called hydrotropism. Then again, plants also respond to contact, touch. If the stimulus is contact, then it shall be called thigmotropism. So these 5 are the major tropic responses, growth responses that usually happen in plants. So we want to look at each one of them. So we have phototropism, geotropism, chemotropism, hydrotropism, and thigmotropism. So 1, phototropism. So from just what we have mentioned, we can easily define phototropism. Tropism, we have said, is a growth response, growth movements of the parts of the plants, in response to an external stimuli. Our external stimuli in this case is light. So is growth response of parts of the plants, in response to direction of light, direction and intensity of light. So this direction and intensity of light. So the major stimulus there is light. So you realize that we have 2 types of phototropism on a plant. Some parts will grow towards the light, others will grow away from light. The parts that grow towards light are the shoot. So the shoot are positively phototropic because they grow towards, the shoot will grow towards light. But the roots are growing away. As the plant is growing up to reach light, the roots are growing into the soil deeper. So they become negatively phototropic. Shoots are positively phototropic. In other words, they'll grow towards light. But roots are negatively phototropic. All these 2 are important. Positive phototropism, important. Negative phototropism for roots are important. Shoots are growing towards light so that it can obtain light for photosynthesis. Roots are growing away from light. The negative response is important so that it can go deep into the soil, acquire anchorage or firmness for the plant, and at the same time be able to acquire water and mineral ions. Then 2, we have hydrotropism. That's the same way we have defined phototropism. The only thing that has changed here is the stimulus. Stimulus is water, is growth, movement of parts of the plants, in response to water or moisture. So the roots are the ones that are positively hydrotropic. Roots are positively hydrotropic. In other words, the roots will grow to earth where we have water, but the shoots are negative. Negatively, I'll use simples there, negatively hydrotropic. 3, we have geotropism. Again, it's the same thing. The stimuli here, we have already gone through this. Stimulus, that is gravity, is growth, movements of parts of the plants, in response to gravity. So in this case, the roots are the one that will be growing to earth, the gravity, while the shoots are growing negatively away from the gravity. Shoots are positively geotropic, and roots negative, not positive. Roots are positively geotropic. So in fact, the remaining we can just explain. We have now chemotropism. Again, chemotropism, growth response of parts of the plant in response to gradient concentration of chemicals. Of parts of plant in response to gradient concentration of chemicals. We can give an example here because it's not very common to ascertain, e.g. growth of pollen tube. The pollen tube grows through the style toward the embryo sac in response to chemicals that are secreted in the embryo sac. Growth of pollen tube in style of flowers toward chemicals in the embryo sac. Embryo sac, that structure in the ovule, the one that forms the ovule, is the one we call the embryo sac. And then the last one, Tropism. Now we can use an example even before you explain. If you have looked at herbaceous plants, the ones that are not woody, non-woody plants, like beans or peas, if they are not going to find an object to support it, it is going to wander on the ground. It will grow prostrate on the ground. But if, for example, there is another stiff object like a pole close to it, and this is the plant, you realize that it will start coiling around that plant or around that other hard structure. This is the effect of Tropism. So once it gets into contact, so if it was at that point, it is growing. It gets into contact with that. Auxins will come in. You are going to explain how that one happens. Auxin will come in and it will start coiling around that object. Instead of growing away from that hard object or a stable object, it starts to coil around it so that it can obtain support. So the idea here is contact being the stimulus. So it's growth, movement of parts of the plants in response to contact with a hard object. We give an example here again, e.g. peas or the tendrils of peas, they'll produce some structures called tendrils of cowpeas. It has used that, cowpeas, coils around other strong stems of woody, plants. So these are the major types of tropism, but we have said they are classified depending on the stimuli. If stimuli is contact, then it is called Tropism. So how are these tropism important? Importance of tropisms. To determine the importance of this tropism, all you need to do is just identify the tropism and find out how is it helping the plant. We can explore together this. Look at phototropism. How is this going to be important to plants? We have said phototropism is growth response, movement of parts of the plants towards light. Why should plants move towards light? In the process, you realize that it is going to expose, as plant move towards light or grows towards light, it will expose leaves so that it can obtain sunlight for photosynthesis. At the same time, it will expose flowers because as leaves are growing, also together we have flowers being exposed into the atmosphere in strategic positions, so that now we have pollinators, the insects coming. As they forage on the flowers, they are going to deposit or take away pollen grains. So phototropism helps plants to reach light for photosynthesis. To reach light for photosynthesis. But also, I've said, as the plants are reaching light for photosynthesis, also flowers are exposed to pollinating agents. Also, flowers are exposed to pollinating agents. If you look at any other, like hydrotropism, again, you just find out why is it that roots will be growing towards, they are positively hydrotropic, towards the water, so that it can obtain water for various purposes. We know the role of water in plants. Like water is a medium for several biochemical reactions in the cells of the plants. In some other plants, water is important because it gives it agility, and agility is able to give the plants firmness or mechanical support. So hydrotropism enables plant roots, reach water sources. Water sources. For what purpose? For purpose of maybe for mechanical support, for obtaining tagger, for support. Tagger comes from turgidity. The plant cells becomes firm when they absorb water, and in the process they are able to give the plant firmness or mechanical support. We also know other roles of water acting as a medium for biochemical reactions. We can just mention but a few. We have several roles of water in plants. Then 3, geotropism. Mebaki ngapi man? Ngapi tano? Wacha nimalize hii. Geotropism enables plant roots to reach mineral salts in the soil. Thigmotropism, just like the way you have already described one example here for thigmotropism, is going to enable those plants that are non-woody, herbaceous plants, to obtain support. Otherwise, they'll always be flat on the ground. Thigmotropism enables non-woody plants to obtain support. This support is important because it will now allow the plants to grow upwards so that it reaches enough sunlight, and at the same time expose the flowers to pollinating agents. I think which one have we left out? Hydrotropism, chemotropism. Chemotropism. We gave a very good example. It's going to enable the pollen grain, the pollen tube, to grow to earth. Pollen tube to grow to earth, embryo sac. Why is this one important? It's because pollen tube carries the male nuclei and generative nuclei, which will bring about fertilization. If it is in angiosperms, double fertilization to bring about fertilization. Mbili ama ni 10? Mbili ama 10? Mbili. Sasa zimeisha ama nini? Because we have other something here. Endelee. Now, I think you have understood some of the roles of hormones in plants, but in our next lesson we are going to look at how auxins are going to influence the tropic movements, as we have already gone through. We shall look at how auxins can influence, maybe for a very specific example, geotropism and phototropism. I think you have enjoyed the lesson. You can continue even researching more on the same through the internet and in your school library. Thank you.